My name is Augustine. I'm a political science student at Amherst College, and I'm Kenyan. Um, and I'm concerned about the idea or the um, sort of, I would say, popular thing to do of critiquing, the present, or trying to you critique the present and argue that it's not working out. But not necessarily look forward. How do we then move on from here to the future? And specifically thinking about the United Nations, and one of the comments that you made was to critique it as, or for the fact that it recognizes nation states. The UN essentially it's made up of members. And my question is, does the UN actually, rather than sanction nation states, does it actually suggest the failure of nation states and a need for a global governing body that, whether it's working or not, that concept of the United Nations itself, does it lead us away from the nation state rather than towards the nation state? And in my mind, I have the recent case where UNESCO recognized Palestine, which is a contradictory example to give, because it's recognizing a state, yet it, in a way overread the idea that the United Nations is a kind of a stooge of certain nations and not an independent body. So moving forward with the United Nations, do we continue to critique it as a failure or a sanction of nations or nation states, or do we see it as, at least in a probably utopian way, a suggestion at least that there's a need for a global governing body, and maybe from moving here or moving forward is what we need to work on is how do we strengthen these international or sort of administrative bodies or organizations with the fundamental sort of objective of how do we move on from here, rather than just critique history, critique present. How do we move on from here? Is the United Nations the way to go or not?
2 or 3 points. Firstly, I have not critiqued what is happening. My criticism is that I cannot accept a static view of the status quo. I believe that the world is based on the concept of change. And change will come whether you like it or not. You change every day, you get older. You can try your best to stay the same age, but you will not succeed. And so the concept of change is part of the fundamental physiological and physical rules of the world. But somehow, in the United Nations, we have not understood this. The United Nations is based on an assumption. And the assumption is that we are still in 1945. And you cannot teach the United Nations that it is 2012, not 1945. This building, and I'm sorry to tell you an ugly truth, this building is supposed to be a table with 193 chairs. That is not so. It is actually 2 tables. One table with only 5 chairs, and another table with 187 chairs. And the difference is that the table with 5 chairs eats caviar and smoked salmon, and the table with 187 chairs eats bones and scraps and hot dogs. That is the difference between the 2 tables. And now, who is sitting on those 5 chairs? A bunch of countries who themselves wrote the charter. The charter has nothing to do with you and me. It was drafted by 4 countries sitting in an estate in Washington called Dumbarton Oaks in 1944. And they just brought it in San Francisco in 1945 and said, sign. And people saw it for the first time in 1945. It was pre-drafted. You only had to sign. And some countries, which included close allies of the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Mexico, said, "¿Qué pasa? What's going on? What is this business of the veto?" And the US Secretary of State walked in and he said, "No veto, no United Nations." 4 words is all that he used. And so people got scared. But give credit to the Australians, despite their views of 400 Afghans. The Australians refused to accept the American challenge and asked for a vote. And so the veto was a voted decision. It's not a consensus decision in the United Nations. It was voted upon. But the result is that you have 5 countries who have 2 qualities. One is permanence. Now, you know and I know that permanence is not a human attribute. It's an attribute of God. And so these 5 had no difficulty calling themselves God. Permanent, eternal. No change possible, no questioning possible, ever. And secondly, they gave themselves something called the veto, which means that you can have today one of these 5 on one side and 192 countries on the other side, and that one vote counts more than 192 votes. Now, these are countries who talk to us ad infinitum and ad nauseum about democracy. And this is their definition of democracy. And this is what they've learned from Magna Carta and the habeas corpus of 1675 and the revolutions in France and United States. And this is where we are today in 2012, where literally the control is in the hands of 5. The Charter, as the previous speaker told you, the General Assembly can only make recommendations. You can make a recommendation that the sun should rise at night and the moon should rise during the day. And it will pass, incidentally, in the General Assembly. I guarantee you I can get that resolution passed. There's nothing to it, because it has no weight. But the only body which can take action, the word action occurs only once in the Charter, in Article 42, which is the power of the Security Council. Only the Security Council can take action. And so my point is, my criticism, if you wish, is that I'm not against permanent membership. I'm not against the France and Britain and United States and Russia and China. I'm against the concept of a static definition. The whole concept of democracy is accountability, and at some frequency you have to come back and be re-elected. These 5 are never elected. They are hereditary monarchs, actually hereditary gods. And I think it's a shame that we decent human beings should have to accept this. But the problem is that you cannot change the Charter. You cannot change a full stop to a comma in the Charter, because each one of the 5 has to agree before you make any change to the Charter. So you cannot make any amendment to the Charter without the individual permission of each one of the 5. And that is why Germany and Japan correctly stood up and said, the 2 of us, Germany is paying 10% of the budget. Japan is paying 20% of the budget. Between the 2, they are paying 1/3 of the total budget of the United Nations. And today, despite that, they are described in Article 53 as enemy states. They are still enemy states in the Charter. And we consume 1/3 of the budget from their resources. So there's much to be questioned in the United Nations. And your final question was about UNESCO and Palestine. Out of the 193 members, the definition of a state is that you must have a border. You must have a population, a border, a government, and sovereignty. Out of the 193 member states, only one has no borders. That's Israel. I asked the Israeli ambassador every 2 or 3 months, I like to pinch him, so I ask him, can you tell me what are your borders? And he says, no, I can't. I don't have any. I don't know where my borders are. So this UNESCO thing is going to snowball because Palestine has got into UNESCO. If you are a member of one agency, you automatically become a member of the World Health Organization, which is going to meet in March. So Palestine will become a member of the WHO in March. And the next one will be in June. And so we have a problem because the United States has pulled out its funding from UNESCO. Then it will pull out from WHO. Then it will pull out from the next. So ultimately it will have pulled out of everything. And so which is the country then which will be isolated? Palestine or the United States? Think of it. Keep your mind. My only message to you is do not accept the status quo. Change is part of the history of the world. You are the agents of change, not me. I am 74 years old, which means I have one foot in the grave and the other slipping. You are the future. You are the United Nations. You have to take charge. I couldn't, the chairman was very kind to say Ambassador Kamal is good. He can't be good. If he was good, he would give you a better world to live in. But he has not. So obviously, he's not a successful person. So you have to be the successful people. And so the world is yours, and you have to make the change.
Well, on that note, I think we can all express our sincere gratitude to Ambassador Kamal. Thank you very much, Ambassador Kamal.